In our lead story today, we touch down in the nation of Syria, where just past the 3-month anniversary of the ouster of the old regime, the process of peace and reconciliation is ongoing. But despite a long series of mostly positive signs across the country, there are, shall we say, a few last sticking points to be worked out. The one we're going to cover today, well, that's the problem of Israeli warplanes still dropping bombs across Syria 3 months after most of the fighting has concluded. To explain the problem at hand, we're going to zero in on an incident that took place on February the 25th, when Israeli warplanes launched a series of strikes against 2 targets, one in the town of Kisweh, a suburb south of Damascus, and the other in a town in Israel's southern province, Daraa. Both sites, according to the Israeli military, were struck because Israel was attempting to take out military targets, including a headquarters and multiple weapons depots. Luckily, it didn't appear that the strikes left any civilian casualties. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz explained that the airstrikes were an effort to pacify southern Syria, and we'll quote him here, "We will not allow southern Syria to become southern Lebanon." Now, on its face, that's an interesting statement, and we'll return to it in just a moment. But first, we'll ask the question that Syria's new leaders were forced to consider a couple of weeks ago. Was that set of airstrikes a one-off, or would it happen again? On Monday, March 3rd, Syrians got their answer, this time by way of an Israeli airstrike in the northwest of the country on the Mediterranean Sea. There, in the mountains of Latakia province, Israeli troops struck a radar station and a weapons depot. On their journey, they also struck the port city of Tartus, hitting a sea berth used to serve ships. Both the Latakia and the Tartus targets were near 2 major Russian military bases. Again, no civilians were known to have been injured in the blast, a small saving grace when trying to justify airstrikes against the sovereign soil of another nation. In understanding what's going on here, it's worth taking a moment to point out that these are not the only rounds of airstrikes Israel has launched into Syria since the fall of Assad. In the 2 days after the regime was toppled, Israel launched nearly 500 airstrikes into Syria by its own admission. Those strikes took out the vast majority of the former regime's stockpiles of strategic weapons, large portions of its naval fleet, and sites related to suspected ongoing chemical weapons programs. At the time, the logic behind the strikes wasn't hard to see, even if a person disagreed with it. Syria had just been taken over by a coalition of anti-Assad fighters with unclear intentions who had gotten their start in Al-Qaeda. For stockpiles of ballistic missiles, tanks, warplanes, and potentially even chemical weapons to fall into the wrong hands would have been an unequivocally bad outcome. A nation that shares a common border with Syria and has a vested interest in avoiding that outcome, well, they took matters into their own hands. But fast forward about 3 months, and the situation on the ground in Syria is different. The nation's armed forces are well on their way through a restructuring process, taking authority and heavy weapons access away from people with loyalty to the old regime and placing it in the hands of former rebel fighters who appear to be operating in support of a common national interest. Remnant groups of pro-Assad fighters have been progressively hunted down and snuffed out, and the nation is working hard to rebuild institutions of civilian governance, including by way of a grand national dialogue last week. Now, none of the worst fears around Syria's new leaders have materialized. The country's interim ruler, Ahmad al-Sharaa, has proven himself to be a smooth, savvy operator on both the domestic and international stage, and he and his fellow leaders, once hardcore Islamists, are now working to draft a constitution in support of freedom and equality for all Syrians. And quite frankly, it wouldn't be fair to dismiss the real reasons for Israel and the rest of the world to be nervous when al-Sharaa and his coalition took control. But now the situation's changed. So why is Israel still launching airstrikes? Well, to find the answer, we'll start by recalling the words of Israel Katz, explaining those late February airstrikes, that Israel wants to pacify southern Syria and prevent it from becoming a new version of southern Lebanon. That's a particularly meaningful turn of phrase because it's southern Lebanon that Israel just spent months attempting to clear of Hezbollah fighters who'd long used southern Lebanon to amass power and launch attacks against Israel. And if that's one half of the story, the other half also bears resemblance to southern Lebanon because, much like 10 square kilometers of southern Lebanon even today, southern Syria is occupied by Israeli forces. That occupation began as the Assad regime was still crumbling, with Israel pushing forward from a much larger section of territory that it annexed from Syria in 1981 after seizing it in 1967. That territory, the Golan Heights, has long been a point of dispute between the two nations and across the globe. Hours after Syria's rebel coalition entered Damascus, the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, had surged forward from the Golan Heights into a buffer zone that takes up part of Syria's Kenitra province. At that time, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had described the buffer zone seizure as a, quote, temporary defensive position until a suitable arrangement is found. Netanyahu emphasized that with luck, Israel would be able to establish good relations with Syria's new leaders, and any such occupation would no longer be necessary. The new Syrian leadership didn't really address the occupation in any substantive way, probably a smart choice given that it had much more important things to deal with at the time. The occupation was criticized around the world as overreach and a violation by Israel, and even denounced in some corners as a blatant land grab, considering that it placed quite a lot of land directly under Israel's control. Nonetheless, in a practical sense, it was a tolerable situation on the ground at that time, simply on the basis that there was no large-scale fighting and that Syria's new leaders didn't have the means to do anything but tolerate it. But on February the 25th, on the same day as the first recent round of airstrikes, Syria carried out raids in several villages and suburbs in the area it now occupies and began moving into new areas. By that time, Israeli officials had already divulged that their plans had changed and that they'd now be occupying a 15-kilometer zone of control and a 60-kilometer sphere of influence in Syria, each calculated in relation to the old border of the Syrian-controlled Golan Heights. They'd also constructed no fewer than 9 army posts in the buffer zone and issued calls for Israeli settlers to come into the Golan Heights in greater and greater numbers. Then, just hours before Israel launched the February round of airstrikes, Syria had issued its first formal condemnation of the Israeli incursion by way of a national dialogue summit. Syria's new leaders called on Israel to withdraw from the territory, although this time, the opposite has happened. To hear Israel explain the situation, its airstrikes and its territorial expansion in the area are in the name of demilitarization, particularly in Syria's cone of territory south of Damascus. According to Netanyahu himself, Israel refuses to allow Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or HTS in southern Syria and refuses to allow any groups associated with them to enter that same area. HTS is the organization that Syria's new leadership belonged to before they took power, meaning that what Israel is asking for is for the people who currently lead Syria to be barred from the southern part of their own nation. Netanyahu has vowed to permit neither, quote, HTS nor the new Syrian army to enter the territory south of Damascus. He's also called for the full demilitarization of 3 Syrian provinces that comprise that area, Quneitra, Daraa, and Suwaidia. Netanyahu has focused his attention on the Druze in particular, a Muslim minority community in both Syria and Israel who inhabit this area, and insisted that the Druze should not come under threat. Now, without making a claim on whether this is a legitimate reason for Israel to do what it's doing, it's certainly conceivable that from Jerusalem's perspective, a threat in southern Syria could pose major problems. After all, this is a nation that's barely holding a ceasefire in Gaza, that was fighting Hezbollah not long ago, and that has other enemies to worry about in Iran and Yemen. For many years now, Syria has been a hotbed for militant activity, especially for elements associated with Iran and Hezbollah, who've smuggled weapons into neighbor nations and used Syria as a staging ground for attacks. All of that could conceivably happen again, or Iran's reliance on Syria could grow even stronger if Syria remains fractured in the years to come. But that isn't the whole story. Israel is trying to prevent the new Syrian government from maintaining a presence in this area, even when the new Syrian government is far from friendly to Iran or Hezbollah and seems to have no outward intent of doing any harm to Israel. It's simply not in Syria's interests right now to get into it with Israel over the Golan Heights, Hezbollah, or anything else. Unless, of course, Israel happens to be sitting on a large and expanding pocket of sovereign Syrian territory, that is. Even now, Israel's allies in Europe and its partners in the Middle East are actively engaged with the new Syrian government, which is, in turn, doing just about everything it could possibly do to display to the rest of the world its intent to build a peaceful, safe, inclusive new nation. The new government might not have the ability to police southern Syria right now, but if Israel were open to a future in which this seemingly non-threatening new government could hold that territory eventually, then it would be in Israel's interest to at least let the Syrian government into a dialogue on what they're doing in the interim. Instead, Israel has made abundantly clear that the Syrian government, not just traditionally adversarial influences on Syrian territory, is who Israel doesn't want on this territory. Put those statements alongside Israel's efforts to militarize and expand the territory it holds in southern Syria, and what exactly is the world supposed to conclude other than that Israel wants to claim the territory that it already says it's holding indefinitely? And look, at the time of writing, it doesn't appear that Israel's moves will set up any direct confrontation with the Syrian government. After all, Damascus is still far too preoccupied and militarily weak to even think about engaging in such an affair. But even now, there are indications that violence may be soon to follow. An organization called the Islamic Resistance Front in Syria is believed to be setting up cells in the area, backed by Iran, in what may turn into a continuation of Iran's proxy attacks against Israel. The local Druze population is growing increasingly restless, with clear signs and signals that violence there may soon follow. What Israel would do in such a situation isn't known for certain, but look at Gaza, or at southern Lebanon, or at the West Bank, and it isn't exactly difficult to hazard a guess. Let me just interrupt today's video to quickly talk about our fantastic sponsor today, and that is Sheath. Sheath make the best underwear that you'll ever wear. I've talked about it before, I was always a boxers guy, never a briefs guy. Briefs were not my thing. Sheath wanted to sponsor me, and I was like, it looks a bit tight. That looks a bit like briefs. I like my boys to be able to breathe. And so Sheath sent me them, and I wore them for a couple of days, and I was like, oh, I get it. These are like briefs, but they don't suck. They're like boxers, but not super loose. You're not constantly readjusting yourself. They have a dual pouch design for your dual man parts, and you put them in the different pockets, and you put them on, and you're like, oh, everything's just in the right place. You're not constantly readjusting yourself, it's not a good look. And yeah, they're just super comfortable. They're just really a nice pair of underwear. I often say it like you'll buy one pair, and then you'll just go back and you'll buy more. And when you do, always remember to use my link, because Thank you. I mean, all you need to do is go to sheath.com/warfronts, use the code warfronts. Not only will you be doing me and the channel a giant favor by supporting us, but you'll also get 20% off your order. Sheath's the best. Just try it out. You won't regret it. Back to the video. And next up, we turn to the Balkans, where a series of overlapping crises are growing more severe all at once. But we start on the floor of the Serbian parliament, where a legislative body that's long been known for chaos recently took things to a whole new level. The incident took place on the 4th of March during a legislative session that very quickly got out of hand. After approving the day's agenda, the country's ruling coalition pivoted to discuss some of the nation's affairs when a number of opposition politicians left their seats and charged the station of the parliamentary speaker. After brief altercations with security guards, opposition members began tossing smoke grenades and tear gas, which went off inside a chamber that's certainly spacious, but doesn't really have a place to go escape the effects of that sort of thing. Now, the ruling coalition attempted to continue the session after the initial chaos was addressed, but opposition leaders kept up their interference, whistling and blowing horns, while members of the opposition outside Parliament held up signs calling for a general strike and demanding justice for 15 people killed in a railway station roof collapse months ago. 2 parliamentarians were injured in the day's affairs, including one 64-year-old Jasmina Obradovic, who reportedly suffered a stroke and was placed into critical condition at a nearby hospital. These sorts of brawls, they're actually nothing new for the Serbian parliament, but the ones that took place last week were particularly nasty, and for good reason. The opposition leaders in question have been working overtime to force their government to comply with a massive protest movement that's rocked Serbia for months, ever since that railway station roof collapse that we just mentioned. Among the issues at hand for the protest movement, the most central problem of all is that of state corruption by Serbia's leader, Aleksandar Vučić, and the nation's ruling elites. Now, we've recently published an entire episode on Serbia's protests, so do check that out if you'd like to learn more. But to give you a brief overview for those who might not be familiar, the protests are absolutely massive. They've brought together broad and often mutually opposed segments of Serbian society. They've got support all up and down the country, and they've managed to stay peaceful despite car ramming attacks and other offences perpetrated by supporters of the Vučić government. Most important of all, they're widely viewed in Serbia as a last chance in a state where the ruling parties have become more corrupt and more authoritarian as time goes on and are unlikely to give internal dissenters another chance that's anywhere near as good as this one. The brawl in the Serbian parliament was centered around the opposition's demands that the parliament confirm the resignation of Prime Minister Miloš Vučević, as well as his accompanying government. Vučević resigned a few weeks ago amidst the protest, although in a practical sense, he's an interchangeable cog in a much larger machine and was fairly easy for President Vučić to offer as a concession in the protest movement. The Prime Minister's offered ouster hasn't had nearly the calming effect that Vučić had hoped, and as the opposition leader's insistence may indicate, it's not been clear that Vučić was even going to complete the charade of actually accepting his resignation, which doesn't take effect until Parliament validates it. Ultimately, Vučić and his associates attempted to frame the incident as a shameful attack against the country's ruling government. The country's defense minister called it, quote, a disgrace to Serbia, while Vučić took advantage of a convenient photo op holding hands with a lawmaker who'd suffered a stroke as she was in the emergency room. But the brawl in Serbia's parliament That's only half of what we need to talk about today, and the other half actually doesn't come from Serbia at all, but from neighboring Bosnia. There, an autonomous government led and inhabited by ethnic Serbs, the Republika Srpska, controls a large portion of Bosnia's land area while administering many of its own affairs. The autonomous region shares close ties with Serbia and was even part of an all-Serb declaration not too long ago, where it and the Serbian government basically advocated for the idea of a larger Serb ethno-state. Now, the reason that we're visiting the Republika Srpska now, however, is because it's poised to throw all of Bosnia into a constitutional crisis. Basically, the president of the Republika Srpska, Milorad Dodik, was indicted back in August of 2023 for defying decisions made by the Bosnian government, something that Republika Srpska officials dismissed as a set of politically motivated attacks. Dodik fought the indictment for a while, began his trial in February of last year, and finally, on February the 26th of this year, he was convicted and sentenced. After finding him guilty, Bosnia sentenced him to a year's imprisonment and banned him from performing the duties of the president of the Republika Srpska for a total of 6 years. For Dodik, who's led his region since 2022, led it before from 2010 to 2018, and has basically been the most important person in the region for a decade and a half, it was a hell of a blow against him. But when Dodik's sentence was handed down in Sarajevo, he wasn't there to receive it. In fact, he had insisted beforehand that he would disobey any conviction, and that if he were convicted, he'd respond with a whole range of radical measures, the most important of which would be the eventual secession of the Republika Srpska from Bosnia. After the conviction was handed down, Dodik and his government did precisely that, passing legislation that barred both the Bosnian National Police and the Bosnian judiciary from entering the Republika Srpska at all. After all, if those officials are barred from entry, then they can't actually do anything to Dodik, least of all getting him to come to Bosnia and serve a prison sentence. Talk of secession by the Republika Srpska is nothing new. Dodik has long advocated for it to separate from Bosnia and join Serbia, something that got him slapped with heavy US sanctions over the last few years. Serbs in Bosnia have a long history of violent confrontation with the area's other residents, including in the war that went on in the country from 1992 to 1995, leaving roughly 100,000 people dead and displacing millions in the process. Dodik, during his own tenure, has frequently rejected or rebuffed the decisions of Bosnian authorities, even after those actions finally got him indicted. After his decision to resist Bosnia's conviction, Dodik earned praise from Serbia's President Vučić, who decried the verdict against him as, quote, shameful, unlawful, anti-democratic, and designed to break down Republika Srpska and the position of the Serb people. Vučić went to the Republika Srpska in support of Dodik after the verdict was handed down. In a worst-case scenario for Dodik, he'd likely be able to escape to Belgrade and enjoy Vučić's protection rather than ever being taken into Bosnian custody. Dodik has also drawn support from friendly Hungary under Viktor Orban and from Russia, a long-time supporter of the breakaway region. At this stage, it's up to Bosnia to decide what to do about this situation. And fundamentally, Bosnia has two options that it can choose from. Option one is that it can decline to pursue Dodik, let its conviction against him stand, keep up hopes that he might slip up and get arrested traveling inside the rest of Bosnia, and otherwise just let the whole thing blow over. After all, Bosnia did everything it could. It just happens to be a divided state system where sometimes its two component governments are at odds. The other option, however, is for Bosnia to go in and get Dodik, regardless of what Republika Srpska says, and quite possibly to do that by force. And it's here that we can draw our connection between the recent affairs in the Republika Srpska and the protest movement back in Serbia. In that prior episode that we mentioned before, published on February the 5th, we laid out the very difficult set of realities that the Serbian public now has to grapple with. Its protest movement has not yet produced political change, and it's running out of meaningful leverage with which it could force that change. Its ruling government is deeply corrupt and has nothing to gain by acquiescing to the protest movement's demands, but everything to gain by holding its ground. We haven't even mentioned this element today, but the Serbian government also isn't susceptible to pressure from Europe. It's been working to join the EU, but most Serbians no longer have much interest in doing so, and it draws support from allies like Russia, who will tolerate a whole lot more authoritarianism than Europe will. To put it simply, Serbia's peaceful protest movement is being stonewalled by a government that has no reason not to either wait it out or shut it down by force. For now, the protest movement has done well to avoid giving the government any pretext to take violent action, either with the mass use of riot control police, or the deployment of troops, or the leveraging of powerful ethno-nationalist militias that would be more than happy to do the government's dirty work for them. But a constitutional crisis in the neighboring Republika Srpska has the potential to offer Vučić a different pretext to take unilateral control of the nation. If violence breaks out in Bosnia and the Republika Srpska comes to Vučić for help, then of course Vučić couldn't be asked to also deal with mass unrest on the home front. Right? And as we said before on this channel, and as we'll say again, we'd like to live in a world where Serbia's protest movement succeeds. But right now, the Serbian government just does not have enough incentive to give in to the protesters' demands, and they have all of the incentive in the world to do the opposite, if they're given a means to justify it. Hopefully, the crisis in the Republika Srpska won't become that. Hopefully, Bosnian troops or federal police won't try to march into Republika Srpska and apprehend Milorad Dodik. If they do, then the worst fears shared by our team and a range of international experts may rapidly be realized. And on this issue, we really hope we're wrong. And finally, we turn to the African Horn, where for the second week in a row, we've got to use the Situation Room to discuss the spectre of large-scale violence. This time, however, it's not Ethiopia in the spotlight, it's Somalia, where the militant terror group Al-Shabab is on the warpath. The attacks began in late February when hundreds of Al-Shabab fighters launched a series of coordinated raids against villages in the Somali south. Even from those raids alone, casualty numbers indicated clearly that this was not a typical Al-Shabab attack. The Somali government claimed that its soldiers and allied militias had killed over 130 of the Islamists, while Al-Shabab claimed it had killed over 90 soldiers and clan warriors. Using mortars and vehicles loaded with explosives, Al-Shabab was able to capture at least 3 of the 4 villages they targeted, although they were later pushed out of those zones, according to local sources. Al-Shabab's withdrawal is not believed to have been a result of direct confrontation, with their fighters pulling back in advance of the arrival of the Somali military. American warplanes carried out airstrikes in support of the Somali government in one of the several locations where Al-Shabab had made its push. The following day, Al-Shabab attacked a different pair of towns in the same region, with the Somali government admitting that the towns had briefly been taken before having been brought back under Somali control. The actual status of one of those towns is still in dispute. A few days later, Al-Shabab was at it again, attacking several more towns in a region north of the area where they'd attacked previously. This time, Al-Shabab managed to seize a city district on the outskirts of Mogadishu, and they staged a prison break nearby, reportedly freeing dozens of Al-Shabab fighters who had been held there. The following day, the Somali government claimed another high death toll for Al-Shabab, saying that they'd killed more than 70 Islamists in a counterattack. According to state-run Turkish media outlets, the Anadolu Agency, the Somali government leveraged airstrikes in the attack, again coming by way of its partners from the United States. Al-Shabab, however, claimed to have overrun a local military base, and some sources on the ground indicate that one of the villages in question has fallen entirely under the group's control. From there, the violence only continued. On February the 27th, Al-Shabab fighters forced a withdrawal by government troops in a city just 30 kilometers from Mogadishu. That city would eventually be recaptured. 2 days after that, Al-Shabab launched another attack back in the same area where they began their first assault. It's not yet clear what the situation on the ground is in that area, but there are no clear indicators that Al-Shabab has been pushed out. At the time of writing, the Somali government is projecting strength, with the commander of the Somali National Army calling for one great final push against the Islamists and claiming that they're close to collapse. But the tempo, apparently mixed results, and geographic range of Al-Shabab's offensive thus far seems to indicate otherwise. The US Embassy, getting information from the same government that's helped combat Al-Shabab in this recent spike in violence, has indicated that more attacks are imminent. By the time this episode is released, some of those attacks that are probably taken place. In order to understand the nature of these Al-Shabab attacks, we've got to focus on 2 key elements: geography and timing. First, when it comes to geography, Al-Shabab is choosing to attack areas that were formerly under its control prior to 2022, when a US-backed push by the Somali government and clan militias had proved able to force them out. Al-Shabab has chosen to target areas of symbolic value, including areas close to where Al-Shabab used to maintain regional headquarters or set up posts that granted them control over significant swaths of territory. With the group attacking in such large numbers and across such a wide range of targets, All outward indicators are that their goal is to take back the territory. Second, on the question of timing, Somalia is now just weeks away from the anticipated start of the rainy season. That time of year is difficult for military operations in Somalia, no matter what side you're on, as rain softens the sandy grounds and makes it difficult to move through. Not only that, but it also deprives Al-Shabab of one of their key instruments of control over civilian populations in areas they do control, depriving them of water that's scarce for the rest of the year. For Al-Shabab to take territory ahead of the rainy season, when it's mobile and when it can exercise local control, gives it an opportunity to use the rainy season to tighten its grip on those areas, knowing that the Somali army will struggle to pull off counterattacks. Additionally, the Somali population, some 99.9% of whom are Muslim, began the Ramadan fast on February the 28th. Ramadan will extend to nearly the end of March, during which time Somali and clan fighters observing the fast will be enduring physical hardships that make fighting more difficult. Al-Shabab frequently exploits Ramadan to conduct operations, as do other jihadist organizations across the globe. Now, look, it's certainly not impossible the momentum will shift in the Somali countryside, but at least for now, it appears that the National Army and its associated clans are on the back foot. Not all of Al-Shabab's attacks have been successful, and it's beginning to claw back a sphere of influence in zones where it had once been strong and where it can maintain connections to its strongest operational center in the country's southern zones. As the Institute for the Study of War explained in a February 27th update tracking the conflict, quoting here, Al-Shabab's expanded presence would allow it to threaten major government-controlled administrative centers and a major highway that runs between Ethiopia and Mogadishu. Control over the road is a major revenue generation opportunity for Al-Shabab, clan militias, and the local and federal Somali government, given the numerous taxation checkpoints on the road. Bit by bit, Al-Shabab is clawing away the requisite territory that would allow it to control those lucrative zones. And between that, its recapture of towns, and its release of prisoners who can fill its ranks, the organization could well set itself up for snowballing growth in subsequent offensives after the rainy season ends. And on the subject of timing, Al-Shabab's choice to attack now is a sensible one for two other reasons. Somalia is stretched thin right now, and at the same time, it's lacking in international support. On the subject of being stretched thin, Somalia is having to manage a number of problems at once. In the south, the country's agricultural breadbasket, Jubaland, has recently sought a great deal more latitude to operate autonomously, with tensions flaring into violence across just the last few months. Two autonomous regions in the north, Puntland and virtually sovereign Somaliland, are as resistant as ever to coming back under Somali control, and while a recent sweeping offensive by Puntland against the Islamic State has been mostly successful, it's becoming more and more apparent that the Islamic State can probably reconsolidate itself with time once the pressure comes off. Then, in a practical sense, while Somalia's best troops are actually quite good, just check out a 2024 episode we published on the nation's Dinar Brigade of Special Operators, their regular forces, they're a different story. Undermotivated, undertrained, and underpaid, Somali troops are partially reliant on clan allies to join their elite units and do the bulk of the fighting, as regular forces basically park themselves on territory that the government would prefer not to lose. At Al-Shabab's typical pace of attacks, that balance is tenuous but workable, as Somali special operators dart around the country and assist clans in local operations where they're needed. But with Al-Shabab launching a much more coordinated offensive, it's unclear how long the Somali military can keep up. Meanwhile, the African Union has struggled to keep a peacekeeping force together in the country, and troops from Burundi recently withdrew from the very area that Al-Shabab has now stepped up its offensive. Finally, Al-Shabab may be counting on the idea that the United States will soon be wrapping up many of its African operations. While the US did participate in airstrikes against the group during this phase of attacks, they've been splitting their attention between Al-Shabab and the effort to beat back the Islamic State in the north. The United States' recent freezes to foreign aid and its new administration's rhetoric at home suggest that disengagement on the African continent may be on the near horizon. An American disengagement from Somalia, in particular, is something that would confer considerable benefit on Al-Shabab. In the coming weeks, it's likely that Al-Shabab will continue its attacks, scrambling to take as much territory as possible before the natural deadline imposed by the rainy season. What it can achieve in that span of time will set the tone for its later moves outward in what may yet become a particularly violent year, even for Somalia. And now, we turn our attention to South Sudan. The last time South Sudan appeared on this channel, it was just 2 months ago, January 6th. In that Situation Room report, we covered the creaking economy of the world's youngest nation and compared it to a Jenga tower that had just had the last block holding it up kicked away. To quote ourselves, at the time of writing, things appear to be frozen in the moment where the tower is falling but has not yet shattered. Civil war has so far not restarted, but the signs are already there of a coming catastrophe. End of our own quote. Well, 2 months later, we may finally reach the point where the collapsing tower hits the ground. At the beginning of last week, a wave of arrests swept the capital of Juba, targeting prominent members of the armed political party SPLM-IO. The Deputy Chief of Staff, the Petroleum Minister, were all caught in a dragnet that seemed to be targeting their faction. But the biggest problem came when security forces surrounded the residence of Vice President Riek Machar. The head of SPLM-IO, Machar has spent the last half-decade in a power-sharing government with President Salva Kiir, a structure set up in the wake of the civil war. A conflict that not only killed over 400,000 people, but forced millions more to flee their homes. Now, the 2018 peace agreement that ended the fighting could be in danger. SPLM-IO leadership declared the recent arrests, quote, violated the revitalized peace agreement. Jezero Media's report was even more on the nose, with their headline simply declaring South Sudan on brink of civil war. Such a statement is not hyperbole. The 2013 to 2018 conflict kicked off in a similar fashion, with President Kiir maneuvering against Machar and his political faction. A dangerous move in a nation where political loyalty is segregated almost entirely along deep ethnic divides. Home to almost 12 million people, scattered among 60 tribes and groups, South Sudan is mostly dominated by Kiir's Dinka group, who comprise about a third of the population, and the Nuer group, from which his vice president, Machar, hails. For decades now, local elites have used ethnic nationalism as a way of ginning up hatred whenever it suited them. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, better known as ACLED, has written about this process, and we'll quote them here. Political rivals, traditional leaders, and business people weaponize identities through hate speech and patronage networks, mobilizing or partnering with armed youth, government soldiers, and mercenaries. End quote. When South Sudan broke free of its old overlord Sudan in 2011, there were high hopes that these differences could be put to one side in order to build a state that worked for everyone. As The Economist has pointed out, the country's oil wealth at independence was so great that it technically counted as a middle-income country. But rather than become a source of national wealth, oil instead became the latest shiny thing to be fought over. The problem was that South Sudan's reserves of black gold are concentrated in Unity and Upper Nile states, the area Vice President Machar is from and where his ethnic Nuer group are based. So when Kiir and Machar had their first blow-up in 2013, it was suddenly in everyone's interests to try and secure the greater Upper Nile region. The result was both a civil war over territory, but also one divided along ethnic lines. Both sides used hate speech to mobilize their bases, and both committed horrific war crimes. That this carnival of atrocities ever ended was thanks entirely to international pressure on both to sign a peace agreement. But while the agreement created a power-sharing structure, the reality is that Vice President Machar ended the war badly weakened. Not that this seemed to be an issue at first. After a 2-year delay in forming their joint government, President Kiir and Machar seemed to come to a tacit understanding to put aside their rivalry and instead join forces to loot the state. The entire post-war period from 2020 until today could basically be described as plundering on an epic scale, as little things like social cohesion and building a functioning nation were sacrificed on the altar of making Kiir and Machar filthy rich. Now, if you followed our occasional coverage of South Sudan, you'll already know the price paid for this plastic peace. Kiir, Machar, and their loyal allies didn't just rob the state, they stripped it bare. Neonatal wards in the capital, Juba, had their equipment confiscated and sold, leaving premature babies to die in the dark. It was a grotesque free-for-all, but one that mostly stopped the factions from turning guns on one another. That they now appear to be fighting again is likely due to two things: oil, regional unrest. The oil issue is one we've covered before. A year ago, one of the main pipelines exporting crude oil from South Sudan to the distant Red Sea coasts ruptured. Unfortunately, that rupture occurred in a section crossing through one of the most dangerous parts of Juba's northern neighbor Sudan, currently fighting its own devastating civil war. Unable to make repairs, South Sudan was forced to watch as one of its only sources of revenue dried up. According to The Economist, oil supplies 85% of the government's income. With the biggest pipeline broken, the economy contracted by over a quarter. Civil servants and soldiers went without their salaries. More importantly, at least from Kiir and Makar's perspectives, the nation's elites lost their personal piggy bank. As ACLED has written, quote, "Politicians have long plundered South Sudan's main source of wealth, its state-owned oil company, NARPET, to fuel their wars and wealth, and the country remains economically destitute." End quote. Although the pipeline was eventually repaired, the taps remain turned off to this day, all of which may have given Kiir incentive to move against the SPLMIO to ensure his own cut of the dwindling pie remains large enough. The counter-argument from the president's side would be that it was actually Makar's faction who made the first move. And it's here that we get to the second big driver of the current crisis: regional unrest. Specifically, unrest in the oil-rich state of Upper Nile. Upper Nile, as you'll hopefully recall, is where Makar's Nuer group hail from. Last week, an ethnic Nuer militia known as the White Army seized control of the strategic town of Nasir and overran a local army barracks. Although it's impossible to verify, the government claims that the militia is directly associated with SPLMIO. The violence in Nasir is just the latest manifestation of regional tensions that have been building for well over a year. Human Rights Watch claims that army forces loyal to President Kiir have been committing abuses around the town, including launching a Valentine's Day attack on a civilian market and authorizing airstrikes against crowded urban areas. This would probably be a good time to point out that armed forces in South Sudan context may be a little misleading. The 2018 peace agreement called for all ethnic militias to be merged into a single military, but implementation has never happened. So, rather than seeing the army presence as the state exercising its monopoly on violence, the residents of Nasir mostly saw it as their ethnic enemies turning up with guns and telling them what to do. The White Army militia, then, may have seized Nasir as a preemptive defense. Not that you should have any sympathy for the group. Both during and after the Civil War, the White Army was implicated in all sorts of atrocities. Still, their latest moves undoubtedly come against a backdrop of intrigue in the capital. Just last month, President Kiir fired several of Makar's allies from key government posts. A cynical read would be that the White Army's takeover of Nasir was ordered by Makar to help secure the oil-rich region ahead of a potential renewed civil war. Like we said, we have no way of knowing for sure. It could just as easily be a big plot by Kiir to eliminate the power bases of SPLMIO. The president, after all, recently delayed what were meant to be South Sudan's first ever elections until 2026. Nobody seriously believes that when the time comes, they won't get delayed again. Because at the end of the day, that's the South Sudanese story in a nutshell. A story in which a tiny, rapacious elite plot and scheme and stoke deep ethnic divisions, all with the aim of getting richer than they already are. The sad part is that it didn't have to be like this. At independence in 2011, South Sudan not only had vast oil reserves, but also mineral deposits and timber. It could have been a relative success story, a middle-income nation building a robust society. Instead, every single level of government turned into a machine for ripping the value out of the land and leaving the majority of the population to starve. According to the World Food Programme, a quarter of all children are malnourished, with over 2/3 of the entire population classed as acutely food insecure. And now, with the latest maneuvering, it looks like those same elites may be about to drive the nation back into conflict, back into a civil war the country has never had a chance to really recover from. At the time of recording on Friday, still unsure what the impact of these latest arrests will be. We can only hope that it does not trigger yet another conflagration in the world's youngest country. Thank you for watching.